Before the beaches of Normandy, before the thunder of artillery and the endless gray waves filled with ships, there was a man sitting alone in a small English cottage, staring at the rain. His name was Percy Hobart, a British general without an army, a soldier without a war. He had been dismissed, quietly pushed aside, written off as eccentric and unfit for command. To most officers, he was a nuisance. To himself, he was a man whose ideas were 20 years too early. Hobart was not the kind of general who shouted orders or polished medals. He was an engineer, a thinker, the sort of man who would take apart a radio just to see how the wires were twisted. In a profession that worshipped discipline and hierarchy, he worshipped efficiency and imagination. His colleagues called him hobo half-mocking, half-affectionate, and joked that he belonged in a workshop, not a battlefield. It wasn't always like that. In the years after the First World War, Hobart was one of the pioneers of mechanized warfare. He saw tanks not as heavy boxes of armor, but as tools machines that could think and move with purpose. When most officers still dreamed of gallant cavalry charges, he imagined swarms of armored vehicles breaking through enemy lines. He wrote papers, drew sketches, and argued in endless meetings. His reward was a polite silence and a transfer to quieter duties. By 1940, his career was over. The British Army had no use for a man who talked about engineering imagination, while others demanded obedience. He was retired on health grounds, a bureaucratic way of saying, "We've had enough of you." He spent his days reading, tinkering, and pacing the floor while the world outside burned. France had fallen. The Luftwaffe was pounding London, and the man who could have helped redesign the army's future was pruning roses. But genius, even when buried, has a way of leaking through the cracks. Somewhere inside the War Office, someone remembered Hobart, the strange man who talked about turning ideas into steel. They needed him again, though they didn't yet know it. The call came from an unexpected ally. His brother-in-law, a man named Bernard Montgomery. Monty, as everyone called him, was rising fast in the British command structure. He knew Hobart's temper, his stubbornness, and his brilliance. "Percy," he said, "we need you back." Hobart laughed. "The army doesn't want me, remember?" "Maybe not the old army," Montgomery replied, "but there's a new war now, and it needs your kind of madness." When Hobart returned to service, the younger officer stared at him as if a ghost had walked into the room. He was older, grayer, and still muttering about mechanical solutions to impossible problems. But this time, he had one thing on his side, a world that had finally gone mad enough to listen. The early months were humiliating. The army gave him a ragged collection of misfits, engineers, and men who had failed elsewhere. They called it the 79th Armoured Division. To the staff officers in London, it sounded like a dumping ground. To Hobart, it was a laboratory. "If the army won't give me the soldiers I want," he told his aides, "then ill build the soldiers I need." He started visiting factories, junkyards, and training fields. Wherever there was a broken tank, Hobart saw a blank page. He studied the failures of the last campaign's tanks stuck in mud, crushed by mines, stranded by rivers, and asked a single question. What if a tank could do more than just shoot? The idea was absurd to many. Tanks were supposed to fight, not to build bridges or clear obstacles. Yet Hobart believed war had become a problem of logistics and creativity, not brute courage. "The Germans use science," he said, "so must we, but smarter." He had been called arrogant, difficult, even insubordinate. But behind those labels was a simple truth. Hobart refused to accept that something was impossible. If a tank could not cross a ditch, he would invent one that could. If a minefield stopped the advance, he would design a machine that swallowed mines whole. Still, the resistance inside the military machine was enormous. Committees scoffed. Test ranges refused to cooperate. Funding dried up. Hobart wrote letters, long and furious, arguing that the war would be lost not for lack of bravery, but for lack of imagination. "We cannot win tomorrow's war," he wrote, with yesterday's thinking. It was during those long nights, drafting angry memoranda under the yellow light of his desk lamp, that the legend of Hobart's Funnies was born. Though at that time, no one used the word with respect. His colleagues joked that he was building a circus of mechanical freaks. A tank that could swim? A bulldozer with armor? A flamethrower that roared like a dragon? Madness. Yet Hobart had seen enough war to know that madness was sometimes the only sane response. He had watched brave men die because machines had failed them. He had seen courage crushed by mud and wire. He knew that no amount of heroism could substitute for design. In his notebooks, between sketches of sprockets and levers, he scribbled a line that captured his philosophy. "A soldier's life depends on the ingenuity of an engineer he will never meet." That belief would soon change not only his fate, but the fate of thousands on the beaches of France. But in 1943, that was still just a dream, a stack of blueprints and prototypes scattered across the English countryside. To the outside world, Percy Hobart remained what he had always been, a brilliant misfit, tolerated but not trusted, the kind of man who saw the future while everyone else was still reading the past. And as the storm of war gathered across the Channel, his strange little division was quietly preparing machines that no one believed in for a battle that no one yet understood. By 1943, the war had reached a strange equilibrium. The Allies had clawed their way back from disaster in North Africa, and were now planning something almost unimaginable, a direct invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. The target was clear: Northern France. The codename was simple: Operation Overlord. The challenge, however, was unlike anything in military history. To defeat Hitler, the Allies had to cross a sea, storm beaches bristling with mines and concrete, break through the Atlantic Wall, and somehow push inland before the Germans could throw them back into the water. It sounded heroic on paper, but to the planners sitting in smoke-filled rooms, it looked like suicide. Maps of Normandy were spread across the tables in London and Portsmouth. Each beach had a name: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. The code names sounded confident and clean, but the reality behind them was a nightmare of mud, tides, and defenses. German engineers had turned every beach into a death trap. Steel obstacles shaped like crosses, mines buried in wet sand, concrete bunkers watching every approach. Barbed wire laced the dunes. Anti-tank ditches waited just beyond the shore. The biggest fear was not the German army. It was the beach itself. During early rehearsals in England, ordinary tanks bogged down before they even reached the shoreline. Their treads sank into soft sand. Some flipped trying to climb sea walls. Others stalled in salt water, their engines choking. It became obvious: if the tanks could not move, the infantry would die beside them. Reports began to pile up on the desks of Allied headquarters. Standard armor cannot operate in beach conditions. Minefields will delay the advance. Bridging equipment unsuitable for amphibious use. Each memo ended the same way: recommendation: reconsider timing of invasion. But there was no time. Stalin was screaming for a second front. Roosevelt and Churchill had promised one. The invasion had to happen. The question was, how? That's when someone, somewhere, remembered Percy Hobart, the man with the funny tanks. The eccentric general with the strange division no one quite understood. At first, even mentioning his name caused laughter. "You mean the fellow who wanted to make tanks swim?" one officer said. "Yes," replied another, "and the same fellow who might be our only chance." The problem was brutally simple. The solution, if it existed, would have to come from a mind that did not respect limits. Hobart was summoned to a meeting in late 1943. The room was filled with officers, engineers, and skeptics. Charts lined the walls. Tides, fortifications, mine distributions. "General," one of them said, "we're planning to land an army across 40 miles of defended coastline. We need to bring tanks ashore. They can't float, can't clear mines, can't cross walls. What can your division offer?" Hobart didn't hesitate. "Gentlemen," he said, "give me the problem and I'll build the machine." It wasn't bravado. It was the certainty of an engineer who had already lived with failure long enough to recognize it in others. He began listing his ideas with calm precision. A tank that could swim the duplex-drive Sherman. A tank that could lay a bridge the Churchill armored ramp carrier. A tank that could plow mines the flail tank. A tank that could burn enemy bunkers the crocodile. The officers exchanged glances. It sounded insane. One whispered, "This man wants to turn the invasion into a carnival." Another muttered, "And yet he might just pull it off." Within weeks, Hobart's division became the beating heart of the invasion's engineering effort. Workshops sprang up in secret locations across Britain. Crews experimented with canvas screens, steel rollers, explosive hoses. The tests were messy, dangerous, and often hilarious. Tanks flipped, caught fire, and sometimes disappeared beneath the waves entirely. Yet every failure brought a small victory, a better seal, a stronger pump, a smarter design. For Hobart, this was heaven. "Gentlemen," he told his officers, "we are no longer soldiers. We are inventors at war." The scale of the challenge was staggering. The English Channel was cold, unpredictable, and full of currents. Any device that couldn't survive a real storm was useless, and even if they made it ashore, the tanks would have to perform miracles, clear mines under fire, crush barriers, bridge ditches, flame bunkers, and still shoot back. To make matters worse, the Americans weren't convinced. Their high command viewed Hobart's machines as too experimental, too British, too unorthodox. "We'll rely on speed and firepower," they said. "We don't need circus tricks." Hobart, upon hearing this, reportedly sighed and said, "Then God help the men at Omaha." But the British and Canadians were more open-minded. They had learned the hard way in Dieppe 2 years earlier, when a disastrous raid cost thousands of lives because tanks couldn't get off the beach. This time, they would not repeat that mistake. So while the Americans drilled with their standard Shermans, Hobart's Funnies trained in secret. Soldiers learned how to deploy bridges in minutes, how to spin flails that detonated mines ahead of them, how to release smoke screens and lay fascines, giant bundles of wood used to fill trenches. It looked absurd. It looked desperate. But it worked. The more the engineers tinkered, the more the tanks began to resemble living creatures, strange hybrids designed for one terrifying moment of truth. The Sherman DD, for instance, had a collapsible canvas skirt around its hull and propellers at the back. When the skirt inflated, the tank floated like a raft. When it reached the beach, the canvas dropped, and the same vehicle rolled forward firing its gun. The first time it worked in open water, the watching officers broke into applause. Then there was the Churchill Avre, the armored vehicle Royal Engineers. It carried a short, stubby mortar called the Petard, which fired a 40-pound explosive charge nicknamed the Flying Dustbin. One shot could blow a hole through a concrete wall big enough for men and vehicles to pass. Hobart loved it. "Ugly as sin," he said, "but it gets the job done." Every week brought new ideas. A tank with rollers that beat the ground to trigger mines. A bridge tank that unfolded like a steel butterfly. A flamethrower tank that could clear entire bunkers with one burst of fire. Each invention had a name, a purpose, and a touch of madness. Outside the workshops, ordinary soldiers began to hear rumors. "Hobo's got a tank that swims," they said, "and one that spits fire." Some laughed, Others prayed they'd be assigned one. By the spring of 1944, the Allies had amassed a fleet of strange, specialized vehicles unlike anything ever seen. And still, the questions remained. Would they work under fire? Would they survive the surf, the mines, the chaos? Hobart was relentless. He toured every test range, crawling over the machines, covered in grease, barking at mechanics. Perfection isn't optional, he told them. It's the difference between a bridge that holds and a grave that fills. He knew that success in Normandy wouldn't depend on strategy alone. It would depend on design, on the cold logic of steel, and the fragile courage of the men who drove it. The planners began to whisper a new phrase: let Hobart handle it. Whenever a problem arose, a wall too high, a ditch too wide, a minefield too thick, the answer was the same: ask Hobart. It became almost a joke, but a respectful one, because beneath the laughter, everyone knew the truth. Without a solution, there would be no invasion. Without the Funnies, the beaches of France might become another Dieppe. As spring turned to summer, the factories hummed day and night. Thousands of men and women welded armor, stitched canvas, tested engines. The strangest army in history was taking shape, a steel menagerie built by a man who refused to accept reality as it was. And somewhere in the chaos of plans and prototypes, Hobart paused one evening to look at the rows of machines gleaming under the hangar lights. He said quietly to his adjutant, "They think these are toys, but when the day comes, there'll be the difference between a slaughter and a landing." That day was coming faster than anyone imagined. Across the Channel, Hitler's generals were confident the beaches could never be taken. Concrete, mines, and steel would stop anything. They hadn't met Percy Hobart's imagination yet. In early 1944, the British countryside echoed with the strangest noises: engines sputtering, chains clanking, metal shrieking against metal, and laughter, real, unmilitary laughter. It came from a series of hidden workshops scattered across southern England, places the locals whispered about as Hobart's Zoo. They weren't far off. Inside, among the smell of oil and hot steel, tanks were being reborn into something no textbook or manual had ever imagined. This was not an army base, it was an inventor's dream and a bureaucrat's nightmare. Where most officers saw blueprints, Percy Hobart saw characters. Each tank was a personality, a misfit built to solve a single impossible problem. He moved between workshops like a conductor in front of a chaotic orchestra. "Gentlemen," he'd say, his eyes flashing, "let's do something no one has ever dared to do." His engineers adored him. His superiors feared him. The combination worked perfectly. The first creature in his mechanical menagerie was the Sherman duplex drive, known to everyone as the DD tank. It looked like a normal Sherman until it unfolded. Around its hull sat a massive canvas skirt supported by metal struts. When inflated, it turned the tank into a floating bathtub. Two propellers at the back drove it forward through the water. It looked absurd, like a whale in a life jacket, but it worked. The first successful test came on a gray morning at Fritton Lake. Soldiers gathered on the shore, betting cigarettes that the tank would sink. The crew climbed in, closed the hatch, and started the engine. The tank rolled forward, slipped into the water, and kept going. A cheer erupted. One soldier yelled, "Bloody hell, it floats!" Another added, "Give it wings next." Hobart stood silently, watching the machine churn across the lake. When it reached the far side, he allowed himself a small smile. "It floats today," he said. "Tomorrow it swims to France." Next came the Valor, the armored vehicle Royal Engineers, built on the Churchill chassis. It carried a short mortar that fired a 40-pound charge called the Flying Dustbin. The explosion was enormous, enough to blow holes through bunkers or crush anti-tank walls. Hobart insisted on testing it himself. The first round misfired. The second shattered a concrete barrier the size of a house. Dust and smoke filled the air. Hobart coughed, wiped his goggles, and said, "Good. Now make it reload faster." The Crocodile, another Churchill variant, was something else entirely, a flamethrower tank that towed a trailer full of fuel. A blast from its nozzle could turn a bunker into an inferno. The first time it fired, the crew underestimated the back pressure and nearly roasted themselves. Hobart watched, completely unbothered. "If it frightens you," he said, "imagine what it'll do to the Germans." And then there were the Flails Sherman and Churchill tanks with giant rotating drums on their front, each tipped with heavy chains. When the drums spun, the chains beat the ground, detonating mines in a thunderous rhythm. The crews called them kangaroo tanks because they hopped as the explosions lifted their hulls off the earth. During tests, one officer asked whether the noise would give away their position. Hobart replied, "Only to those who survive." Each invention looked stranger than the last. There was the bobbin tank, which carried a giant roll of matting to unroll across soft sand. The fascine tank, which dropped huge bundles of sticks into ditches to create instant bridges. The Ark, or Armored Ramp Carrier, a tank that acted as a mobile bridge for others to climb over. Soldiers joked that if Hobart kept going, he'd build a tea-making tank next. Hobart didn't mind the jokes. He welcomed them. "Let them laugh," he told his adjutant. "They'll stop laughing on D-Day." But behind the humor was discipline. Every machine was tested, improved, and tested again. Crews trained not just to drive or shoot, but to think. Hobart believed that technology was useless without imagination. He pushed his men to treat the machines as partners, not tools. "Remember," he told them, "you are not fighting the Germans. You are fighting the problem." To outsiders, the division looked like a carnival of madness. To insiders, it felt like being part of a secret order. The workshops ran day and night. Mechanics welded in the dark. Engineers scribbled equations on tank hulls. Soldiers drank tea beside piles of spare parts. They called themselves Hobo's Circus, and they wore the name like a badge of honor. The absurdity of it all made it bearable. These were men who had seen war's brutality, who understood that behind every heroic poster was mud, confusion, and death. In their strange machines, they found a sense of purpose. Each bolt they tightened might one day save a platoon on a beach far away. Word spread through the army. Some units requested to train with Hobart's men. Others mocked them. "You and your funny toys," one officer sneered. Hobart only shrugged. Better toys than tombstones? There were failures, of course. A DD tank that sank before its skirt inflated. A flail that tore itself apart. A crocodile that burst into flames when its trailer was hit by a stray bullet. Each disaster was studied, improved, and logged in what Hobart called his Book of Mistakes. He carried it everywhere, a small, oil-stained notebook filled with sketches and notes. Mistakes, he'd say, are just future victories in disguise. As the months passed, his machines became more reliable, more refined. But the bureaucracy never stopped trying to shut him down. Reports arrived from London questioning the cost, the secrecy, the eccentric leadership style. Hobart responded with his trademark sharpness. "If you can build a cheaper miracle, I'll happily resign." His confidence was infectious. Even skeptical officers began to visit his camps to see the marvels themselves. They would leave shaking their heads, half amused, half impressed. One major general said afterward, "Hes mad as a hatter, but I wouldn't bet against him." Hobart's wife once wrote that he came home every night looking like he'd crawled through a chimney, grease on his hands, soot on his face, eyes alive with excitement. "You look exhausted," she said. "Exhaustion is the price of invention," he replied. By April 1944, his circus had turned into a finely tuned machine. Units drilled in amphibious landings, mine clearing, and obstacle demolition. The men learned to work under fire, to coordinate with infantry, to adapt when something inevitably went wrong. The motto of the division became simple: "There's always a way." And in that phrase lay the essence of Hobart's genius. Where others saw failure, he saw feedback. Where others hesitated, he experimented. To him, the battlefield was not a fixed arena, but a puzzle waiting for a new tool. There was one particular test that became legend. On a foggy morning, Hobart ordered several of his new tanks to perform a mock assault on a fortified position. The officers watching doubted it would work. The Funnies rolled forward, flails spinning, bobbins unrolling, bridges dropping. Within 15 minutes, they had crossed obstacles that had taken weeks to build. When the smoke cleared, the spectators stood in stunned silence. Hobart turned to them and said softly, "Now imagine it under fire." His point was made. By May, the code name Hobart's Funnies had spread through the Allied command. What began as a joke had turned into a badge of pride. Churchill himself took an interest, visiting one of the testing grounds. The Prime Minister, amused by the spectacle, asked, "And what do you call that one?" Hobart, without missing a beat, replied, "That, sir, is what makes the difference between winning and losing." The men who served under him started to believe it. They practiced deploying bridges in under 2 minutes, detonating minefields in synchronized sweeps, firing the flying dustbin with deadly precision. Each day they grew more confident that, when the invasion came, they would not just survive, it would work. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the German commanders built more bunkers, planted more mines, and congratulated themselves on their impregnable defenses. They studied tide tables, artillery arcs, and terrain. But there was one variable they never accounted for: a British general who believed machines could think. In the quiet before D-Day, Hobart visited every unit in his division. He shook hands, inspected engines, and gave his men the same speech each time. "When you land," he said, "remember this. No matter what happens, you have already done the impossible. The rest is just work." On the evening of June 5, 1944, his Funnies were lined up on the southern coast of England, engines idling beneath camouflage nets. Crews smoked their last cigarettes, checked their gear, and stared at the dark horizon. The sea was rough, the air electric. Hobart stood with them, hands behind his back, watching the waves. One of his officers asked if he was nervous. He smiled faintly. "Not nervous," he said. "Curious. I've been waiting years to see if the world can finally keep up with my imagination." As the ships began to load, the men of the 79th Armoured Division knew they were carrying more than machines. They were carrying the embodiment of one man's stubborn genius. Soon, the beaches of Normandy would test every bolt, every weld, every spark of that imagination. And the world would discover whether Percy Hobart's madness was, in fact, sanity, after all. By the time summer crept across England in 1944, the world's greatest invasion was just weeks away. Across the Channel, Europe waited like a locked door, and the key had to be forged from steel, courage, and something far stranger, Percy Hobart's imagination. But imagination, in the military world, is a dangerous thing. Hobart's circus was now a legend in whispers. His soldiers adored him. His engineers would follow him anywhere. Yet the higher you climbed in rank, the less certain people became about him. To the bureaucrats and planners in Whitehall, he was a risk wrapped in eccentricity. The invasion plan was already fragile. Did they really want to hinge part of it on one man's funny tanks? Meetings stretched for hours. Charts and memos filled the tables. Generals debated logistics, air cover, and tides. Somewhere amid the chaos sat a line item labeled 79th Armored Division Specialized Vehicles. It looked like a footnote, but Hobart knew it was the make-or-break detail of the entire operation. He wasn't invited to most of those meetings, of course. He was too direct, too blunt, too impatient with the niceties of military diplomacy. When reports trickled back that senior officers were concerned about the unproven reliability of his inventions, he didn't send polite rebuttals. He sent results. Demonstrations were arranged. Generals and staff officers gathered at testing ranges across Britain. Hobart arrived in his oil-stained uniform. No medals, no ceremony. He spoke little. The tanks would do the talking. The first test began at a place called Burton Bradstock, a lonely stretch of English coast chosen to mimic the beaches of Normandy. The wind howled. The sea churned gray and cold. Hobart's men lined up their contraptions, the flails, the bridge layers, the amphibious Shermans. To the observers, it looked like a scrapyard parade. When the whistle blew, chaos turned into choreography. The DD tanks inflated their canvas skirts and rolled straight into the waves. For a moment, the generals laughed until the tanks kept floating. They chugged forward, engines humming, propellers splashing. When they reached the beach, the skirts dropped, and the tanks drove on to dry land, firing blanks toward mock bunkers. Then came the flails, spinning their heavy chains, detonating mines in rhythmic bursts that echoed through the cliffs. Behind them, AVREs fired their massive flying dustbins, pulverizing concrete obstacles into dust. Bridge layers unfolded their steel ramps like mechanical flowers. In less than half an hour, the impassable beach had been conquered. The spectators, still covering their ears, could hardly believe it. One of them, an American colonel, turned to Hobart and muttered, "Well, it'll be damned." Hobart, brushing sand from his coat, replied dryly, "That's the general idea, Colonel. Not every test went so smoothly. Some tanks flooded when waves rose higher than expected. Others jammed, misfired, or broke their tracks. But Hobart wasn't discouraged. A failed test, he said, is just an early success that hasn't finished growing." Still, not everyone shared his optimism. The Americans remained skeptical. They were proud of their Shermans and their doctrine of speed and aggression. The U.S. commanders argued that there was no time to retrain troops on strange new machines. They preferred simplicity. When Hobart heard that the Americans planned to go ashore without his funnies, he slammed his fist on the table. "Then they'll pay for that decision in blood," he snapped. It was a harsh statement, but history would prove him right. In Britain, the doubts came from a different place. Fear of embarrassment. Some officers worried that if the Funnies failed under fire, the entire operation would become a public humiliation. "What if the tanks sink?" one asked. "What if the bridge collapses?" Hobart stared at him and said, "What if they don't?" His defiance became legendary. A junior officer once asked if he ever worried about ridicule. Hobart smiled. "Young man, ridicule is the tax we pay for thinking differently." Even Churchill himself grew curious. The Prime Minister visited one of Hobart's demonstration grounds near Salisbury Plain. Surrounded by generals and aides, he watched as a crocodile tank fired its flamethrower across a field, engulfing a mock bunker in a roaring inferno. The heat rolled over the crowd. Churchill's hat nearly flew off. He turned to Hobart and said, "My God, what a beast." Hobart bowed slightly. "Yes, sir. We thought it might liven things up." Churchill laughed, but his face turned serious. "General Hobart," he said, "you have my confidence. Make sure these machines do their work. The world is counting on them." That endorsement silenced many critics, but not all. Some in the War Office still called him unorthodox, reckless, even unstable. They didn't like his independence or his refusal to flatter superiors. But by then, it hardly mattered. His division had become indispensable. Training intensified. The crews practiced loading their tanks onto landing craft, deploying from choppy seas, and clearing beach obstacles under simulated fire. The exercises were brutal. Tanks sank. Men drowned. Engines failed. Hobart attended every single one. When a young sergeant lost his life in a test gone wrong, Hobart wrote to his widow personally. He told her that her husband's death will save 100 others when the real day comes. He wasn't being poetic, meant it. To his men, Hobart was both terrifying and beloved. He could explode in anger over a loose bolt or a lazy weld, then spend the night helping a mechanic fix it. Perfection, he'd say, isn't arrogance, it's duty. They called him the old man, but not as an insult. It was a title of respect. As June approached, tension built. The weather was unpredictable, the Germans alert. Every rumor of a leak sent shivers through the camps. The Funnies were kept under tight secrecy. Crews were forbidden to discuss their equipment, even among friends. The code names Crocodile, Crab, Bobbin were meant to disguise their true nature. One day, a skeptical senior officer visited Hobart's base. He inspected the machines, unimpressed. These contraptions, he said, look more like circus wagons than weapons of war. Hobart leaned close and replied, "Good. The Germans won't know what to make of them either." He was right again. Meanwhile, across the channel, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was reinforcing the beaches with obstacles designed specifically to trap tanks. He believed that if the Allies could be stopped in the first 24 hours, the war would be over. Rommel's men filled the sand with steel spikes, mines, and concrete walls. It was, by every conventional measure, an impregnable defense. But Hobart's mind didn't work in conventional measures. For every new obstacle, he already had a countermeasure. Floating tanks for the surf, flails for the mines, bobbins for the mud, bridges for the ditches, fire for the bunkers. He had created, in effect, an entire toolkit for defeating the Atlantic Wall. Yet, even with the evidence before them, some Allied planners hesitated. They worried that the machines were too complicated, that they might break under stress. Hobart grew increasingly frustrated. "You don't win wars by playing safe," he barked during one meeting. "You win by refusing to stop thinking." He wasn't exaggerating. The entire invasion depended on momentum. If the first wave got stuck on the beaches, the following waves would pile up behind them, trapped and slaughtered. Every minute counted. Every obstacle cleared meant hundreds of lives saved. As D-Day drew near, Hobart spent sleepless nights reviewing last-minute reports. He read maintenance logs, weather forecasts, and tactical notes. He personally inspected the tanks, crawling under hulls, checking seals, testing flamethrower valves. Officers tried to stop him. He was a general, after all, but he waved them away. "If a man can die inside one of these," he said, "the least I can do is get dirty checking it." The final rehearsal took place at Studland Bay in late May. Hundreds of soldiers gathered to watch the full performance. Hobart stood on a hill, coat flapping in the wind, binoculars in hand. The order was given. The first wave of DD tanks slid into the water, skirts inflated. They moved gracefully for a moment. Then a sudden gust of wind hit. Several tanks began to take on water. Panic spread. 2 sank completely before the crews could escape. The spectators froze in horror. Hobart lowered his binoculars. His face was pale, but his voice was steady. "Fix it," he said. "Find out why and fix it." Within 48 hours, his engineers had redesigned the venting valves and added reinforcement to the skirts. Every crew was retrained on emergency procedures. By the end of the week, the tanks were running perfectly again. Hobart's response to tragedy wasn't retreat, it was iteration. That incident became a quiet legend in his division. When something went wrong after that, soldiers would murmur, "Fix it Hobo's way." The skepticism never fully disappeared. Some men thought the Funnies were miracles. Others thought they were toys. Hobart didn't care either way. History, he said, won't ask what you believed. It'll ask what worked. As the last days of May ticked by, the 79th Armored Division received its final orders. They would not land as a single unit, but be divided among the British and Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno, Sword. Their machines would lead the assault, clearing the way for infantry. The Americans, still unconvinced, declined to use most of Hobart's designs. They took a few amphibious Shermans, but ignored the flails, the bridge layers, the crocodiles. It would prove a fateful choice. On the night of June 5th, as the invasion fleet assembled, Hobart walked among his men one last time. Engines idled in the darkness. The air smelled of salt and diesel. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. "Tomorrow," he said, "the world will call us madmen or saviors. Either way, they'll have to spell my name right." Then he saluted, turned away, and watched as his machines rolled onto the landing craft, his strange, armored children heading toward history. The skeptics still doubted. The planners still worried. The seas still raged. But somewhere deep down, every man who had ever seen one of Hobart's Funnies in action knew the truth. If anything could break the Atlantic Wall, it would be these impossible inventions, and the stubborn genius who refused to stop believing in them. And in less than 24 hours, the beaches of Normandy would decide whether Percy Hobart was a fool or a visionary who changed the very meaning of war. When the guns fell silent and the tides washed the blood from the beaches of Normandy, few men outside the 79th Armored Division truly understood what had happened there. The headlines spoke of bravery, sacrifice, and victory. They mentioned Eisenhower, Montgomery, and the Great Clash for Europe. But buried beneath the glory was the story of a man whose machines had made that victory possible. Men the army had once laughed at, then quietly relied upon when the world was at its darkest. Percy Hobart did not stand on a balcony to receive applause. He did not give triumphant speeches. In the weeks after D-Day, he simply went back to work. His division still had tasks to complete, bridges to cross, canals to clear, fortifications to demolish. While newspapers printed photographs of soldiers waving flags on the beaches, Hobart's men were already designing the next set of tools to breach the Siegfried Line. To them, Normandy was proof, not closure. Proof that imagination could save lives. Proof that engineering could win battles. Proof that the world had finally caught up with Percy Hobart's madness. Reports from the front began to filter in. Commanders described how the flails cleared minefields that would have taken hours by hand. The crocodiles burned out bunkers that had pinned entire companies. The bridge layers turned impassable ditches into highways. And the DD tanks, those absurd floating Sherman shad, carried armored firepower to the beaches faster than anyone believed possible. The difference between success and disaster was, in many places, the presence of a funny tank. On Sword, Gold, and Juno, where Hobart's creations led the assault, the beachheads were secured by noon. On Omaha, where the Americans had refused most of them, the sand turned red. The lesson was brutal but clear. Ingenuity was not a luxury. It was survival. Hobart didn't gloat. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply wrote in his notebook, "Innovation validated under fire." It was the most understated victory lap in military history. As Allied forces advanced across France, Hobart's circus followed. Every new obstacle inspired another idea. In Holland, His tanks helped cross flooded plains and riverbanks. In Germany, they battered through the last lines of resistance. Wherever the terrain seemed impossible, someone would inevitably say, "Get Hobo's boys on it," and the problem would disappear beneath a roar of engines and the grinding of steel. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the 79th Armoured Division had become legendary among those who fought alongside it. Infantrymen swapped stories about the mad tanks that cleared the way. Engineers whispered Hobart's name with a mixture of awe and affection. Even the generals who had doubted him sent private letters of thanks. And yet, when the parades rolled through London, Hobart was not there. His men marched, his machines clattered past in formation, but the man himself stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, hands in his pockets, a faint smile beneath his mustache. "They're beautiful," he murmured to a friend. "Ugly as sin, but beautiful." He was promoted, of course, formally recognized for his contributions. But medals and titles meant little to him. What mattered were the lives his machines had saved, and the lesson they had carved into military history. Never underestimate imagination under fire. In the years that followed, armies around the world studied Hobart's designs. His ideas became the foundation of modern combat engineering. The concept of specialized vehicles, mine clearers, bridge layers, amphibious armor became standard doctrine. His fingerprints were on every blueprint, even if his name wasn't. But like so many visionaries, he found himself out of step with peacetime. Bureaucracy returned, slow and cautious. Innovation gave way to budgets and committees. Hobart retired once more, this time by choice. He spent his final years lecturing young officers, urging them to think, to question, to build. "The next war," he told them, "won't be won by those who copy what worked last time." He died in 1957, quietly, with little fanfare. No great funeral procession, no monuments, just a few old comrades who remembered a man who'd refused to play by the rules, and in doing so, had rewritten them. Today, if you visit the military museums of Britain, you can still see his creations. A crocodile tank stands silent, its flamethrower rusted but menacing. A DD Sherman rests behind glass, its canvas skirt folded neatly, like a sleeping giant. Tourists walk by, snapping photos, smiling at the strange shapes and odd contraptions. Few realize that these funny tanks once turned the tide of the most important battle of the 20th century. But the soldiers who survived remember. They remember crawling behind the flails as mines exploded harmlessly ahead. They remember watching the crocodile's fire consume a bunker that had seemed invincible. They remember driving ashore in a Sherman DD, terrified, certain they would sink, and then feeling the tank roll onto dry land, alive. To them, Hobart wasn't a genius in theory. He was the reason they were still breathing. In the grand narratives of history, men like Hobart rarely get center stage. He wasn't a conqueror, a strategist, or a statesman. He was something rarer. A thinker who understood that war is not only fought with courage, but with creativity. His legacy isn't measured in medals, but in moments when machines built in muddy workshops turned chaos into possibility. Modern military engineers still study his work. The bridge-laying tanks that crossed the Rhine, the amphibious armor used in Korea and Vietnam, even the specialized breaching vehicles of the Gulf War all trace their lineage back to his blueprints. His fingerprints are in every design that tries to solve the unsolvable. There's a saying among British sappers. Hobart thought of it first. They say it half as a joke, half as a creed, because in one way or another he did. If there's a lesson in his story, it's not just about machines or warfare. It's about defiance, the refusal to accept that something can't be done simply because it hasn't been done before. Hobart's genius wasn't in his inventions alone, but in his mindset, that a problem, no matter how impossible, was simply an invitation to imagine harder. He once wrote, "The measure of a man's courage is not how long he stands under fire, but how far he is willing to think while the shells fall." That sentence might as well be carved on his tombstone. Because Percy Hobart's war was never just against the Germans. It was against small thinking, against the tyranny of it can't be done, against the fear that kills ideas before they are born. And in that war, he won more completely than most generals ever do. When people speak of D-Day, they often describe it as a triumph of bravery, and it was. But beneath that bravery lay something quieter, something mechanical and human at once. A collection of ugly, brilliant machines designed by a man who refused to give up on imagination. And perhaps that's the truest legacy of all, the reminder that even in the darkest moments of history, progress belongs to the dreamers who build, who tinker, who risk ridicule to make the impossible real. So the next time someone calls an idea funny, remember Percy Hobart. Remember the man who built a circus of machines and sent them to war, because sometimes the things that look ridiculous at first glance are the ones that save the world in the end.